Good morning, everyone. I'm here today to talk about climate change from a feminist lens. Before I begin with that, I would like to introduce the organization. So, One Future Collective is a feminist social purpose organization with a vision world of a world built on social justice led by communities of care. Our work is mainly divided into three verticals. Four verticals. We do building just institutions, nurturing leadership communities where we have our leadership programs. We do some healing and justice services work with survivors of violence, and we also engage in advocacy under our influencing public narrative and policy vertical. This is me. I work as a program manager in One Future Collective, and I've been here for about 10 months now. Okay, so we'll just jump right in climate change and gender. Before we begin with any theory or any factual information on that, I would like to ask everyone a question. Is climate change gender neutral? And please feel free to engage in chat. What do you think is climate change or the climate crisis that we are facing as of now? Is it gender neutral? Yes, okay. We have a response saying yes. Anyone else? Do you think climate change is neutral or the climate crisis as we know today, is that gender neutral? Okay, so we will speak about a little how it's in fact not gender neutral. We will focus on how the climate change has differential impacts on people, and this is true across region. Climate change or climate crisis actually exacerbates social, political, and economic vulnerabilities and makes um, and women and girls tend to experience it differently in the sense that if you don't have access to information, if you don't have access to resources, then the way you experience climate change or the effects of climate change will look different, right? Women and girls across the world tend to experience the greatest impacts of climate change, which amplifies the existing gender inequalities as we know in the world that they exist. And these gender inequalities do not just include economic gender inequalities, but they also cover social inequalities and political inequalities. And climate crisis, in this sense, poses a unique threat to their livelihood, health, and safety. Women and girls are not inherently uh, more vulnerable than men to the climate crisis, but it's their social standing, it's their political and economic status that really puts them at a disadvantage because it affects their participation in decision making process, it affects their agency, the survival skills that they learn, and the behavioral choices. Women also tend to make up the majority of people living in poverty, which means women as a group also have the least access to resources, and they are disproportionately responsible for securing food, water, and even fuel for cooking. What this does is then if they are because they are responsible for things like care work at home and ensuring that the family has food to eat, water to drink. That means that women tend to engage with natural resources more than men, which puts them again at which makes their position unique. Which means if they have more dependence on natural resources than men, that means if there is a climate crisis that is affecting the natural resources, they will be more affected than men. Some factors that we look at is socioeconomic factors. So, like I said, they are more likely to be dependent on natural resources for their livelihood. They are more likely to be responsible for securing water, fuel for cooking, and things like that. Agriculture is, in fact, one of the main employment sector for women in low and especially in low and middle income countries, which means during periods of droughts and erratic rainfall, women as agriculture workers and producers work have to work harder to secure income and resources there for their family. This tends to put an added pressure on girls who may even have to drop out from school to help the family for securing income and resources. And it also puts pressure on the mothers because they also have to work harder to secure resources for their families. Then we speak about limited mobility. An interesting example here would be the Hurricane Gorky in Bangladesh in 1991, which saw that 90% of the fatalities in that hurricane were actually women. And research has attributed this fatality rate in the hurricane to the fact that it is a societal norm in Bangladesh that women are expected to stay at home and not leave the home without a male relatives. Now, this one specific societal norm translated into women being most drastically affected in a natural disaster. So what this did was this this societal expectation of staying at home and not leaving the house without a male relative restricted their access to information and made them less likely to evacuate without a male relative. Another factor, if we were to look at, was care work responsibilities, which means they not only are they do not only have to be responsible for securing food, water, and fuel for cooking, but it's also their responsibility to engage in caretaking behaviors. We all know that women are disproportionately responsible for caretaking behaviors at home and across settings. Be- this is being highlighted to further emphasize the importance of climate change and also show that the impact of climate change or the impact of climate crisis is not limited to cutting down someone's access to resources or their decision making, but it's also about how climate crisis also creates psychological distress. So it is the research also shows that after a natural disaster, for example, in the US, African American women are more likely to experience psychological distress than their white counterparts. This happens because climate crisis doesn't just stop with the natural disaster that is happening, right? It's not just about the natural disaster within the moment, or it's not about even um, non-natural disaster about within the moment. It's also about how we recover from that crisis. So a good example and even a recent example of this would be the pandemic. Since the lockdown periods and since things have eased up a bit in for with respect to the COVID-19, what we are seeing is increasing calls to include gender as the focal point for our recovery plans to ensure that women as a group who were one of the hardest hit by the pandemic are able to also recover. So it's not just about who is being affected within the moment, it is also about how we respond to these crises, how we put gender as a focal point in terms of our response to the climate crisis. What happens after a disaster? Like I said, it's a lot about it is a lot about ensuring that we put gender at the center of our policies, which means working on bringing in gender sensitive policies, gender responsive policies that not only look at gender or sex disaggregated data, but it also looks at recovery plans from an intersectional lens. This is where we speak of bringing in a feminist lens. So far, we discussed how climate change looks from a gender lens, but now move from a gender to a feminist lens. When we speak of a feminist lens to climate change, what this means is we are moving from climate change to climate crisis to climate justice. So, when we initially started talking about climate change as a concern, we were using the terminologies climate change, and then we saw a shift across board to climate crisis, and now we speak of climate justice. Before I move ahead, would anyone like to engage over chat? Let me know what you think about climate justice, or what you think about bringing in a feminist lens to climate change. What does that look like? Any thoughts? What does that look like, bringing in a feminist lens to climate change? Or how do you think it's different from a gendered lens to climate change? I'll wait for a couple of minutes if anyone would like to share anything on chat. I've also put the question on chat. What do you think shifts when we bring in a feminist lens to climate change? When we move from a gender lens to a feminist lens to climate change? Any thoughts? Okay, since feminism is the overall empowerment of people instead of any specific gender, this will definitely help in addressing the issue without any bias. Yes. Thank you, Lekha. Anyone else would like to share anything? So think about this. We all are here for this workshop, right? Do you think we all have the same learning needs, or do you think we all have same learning styles? Probably not. So what has brought together to this space is maybe our common interest to climate change, or maybe a common interest in looking at climate change from a feminist lens. But we may have specific learning styles, or we may have specific learning needs. So, for example, if I were to think of a group who is coming together for a workshop on a topic of common interest, we could have neurodivergent people who may have different learning needs, who may prefer a different learning pace as a maybe in comparison with someone who's neurotypical. So, how do we then design a workshop, or how do we then design a session keeping in mind the differential needs? This is where we are moving from gender to a feminist lens. What this means is that we do not see women, or we do not see girls as a homogeneous group. We also look at their other identities that will intersect with their gender, which then together decide or determine their access to resources or their decision making powers. So think about it. Would an upper caste women have the same level of decision making power as someone who comes from a Dalit Bahujan background? Would they have similar access to resources? Probably not. So when we think of recovery plans, when we think of responding to climate action with keeping gender at the core of it, we need to be very mindful of how we define gender, because gender is not just about gender roles or gender norms. It is also about the power relations in a society, which means there is a hierarchy of relationship as in the society as we know, that is, and your intersecting identities determine your position on that hierarchy. It is not just your gender that determines your access to information or your access to resources. It's also your other identities, which is where a feminist lens comes in. So, when we speak of a feminist approach to climate change, we also look at climate justice. Now, the terminology has shifted. We have moved from climate change to climate crisis to climate justice. Climate justice looks at climate crisis not only as an environmental problem, but also a complex social justice issue, which places the populations that are most affected by it at the center of it, which means we'll see that climate crisis or or environmental disasters are very common in certain parts of the world, and it may not be as common in some other part of the world. And our capacity to recover from those disasters, that determines how we are, or that determines which area is more vulnerable to crisis. So, for example, in the recent past that I can think of is Pakistan, and there was a lot of flooding. And according to the international policy frameworks, global north countries are supposed to financially support these countries to be able to recover from such a crisis. We'll speak about that in a bit. But coming back to climate justice, this means that we are looking at climate crisis not merely an environmental problem, but also a complex social justice issue, which keeps the people who are affected by it the most at the center of it. This means tackling the root cause of climate crisis, including things like unsustainable production, consumption, and unethical trade practices, which might be leading to or contributing to making the inequity that exists in a society worse. Then we come to a feminist. So now we look at what a feminist approach to climate justice will look like. So if we are looking at climate justice or climate crisis as a social justice issue, then this means a feminist approach would address the climate change as a complex social justice issue through an intersectional analysis that not only looks at providing immediate relief, but it also challenges unequal power relations based on gender and other identities such as socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, nationality, ability, sexual orientation, and even age. This type of approach advocates for strategies that address the root causes of inequality, that seeks to transform power relations and promote women's rights. So it's not just about keeping women at the center of it, right? Women and children. When we often look at mainstream reports, we will see that they talk about women and children being the most vulnerable in any region to any disaster, to any emergency. But when you actually look at gender, or when you look at the LGBTQI community, what about those people? They are, if they are invisible in the policies, then the relief efforts will also not reach them. And again, bringing in the example of COVID-19 pandemic, right? And the way the governments across the world responded to it. So, for example, in India, there were a lot of schemes that were initiated by the government that allowed the citizens to avail benefits, certain benefits like being able to secure ration for uh, for a subsidized price or for free for a certain period of time, right? But for that, they would need documentation. They would need a ration card, and maybe a particular community, maybe trans community, did not have access to such documentation. So if you do not have that kind of documentation, you cannot avail the benefits. So what I'm trying to say is Even though the government's response to the pandemic or response to the emergency was okay, that we have launched a scheme, citizens will be able to avail the benefits of it, citizens will be available to secure ration for themselves and provide food for themselves, but to avail those benefits, you need documentation proof. And for that documentation proof to happen, you also need to take into account that there are more genders than just men and women. Then, at the documentation level, we need to move beyond the gender binary. Another example of this would be in the first phase of our lockdown, the production of sanitary napkins stopped altogether, and this became a concern because production of sanitary napkins or supply of sanitary napkins was not considered as an essential service. If anyone remembers in 2020 when we had our first lockdown in India, sometime in March, the guideline said that only essential services will be allowed to run. That's production and supply and everything. And supply and production of sanitary napkins was not considered as an essential service, which means that you have effectively overlooked a major chunk of the population who definitely need access to these products, right? Whether it's a lockdown or not a lockdown. This was just one of the examples of what a gender blind policy can do and what kind of impact that can have on the population. You can have a you can have very broad schemes that may be beneficial for the group, but if they are not addressing the unequal relationships, if they are not addressing unequal power relationships, if they are not addressing inequity in terms of access to resources and access to information, then the scheme may not be able to even reach those people who may need it the most. Here's a quote by Marta Fornin, who is a lesbian feminist human rights defender who actively works with indigenous communities who are again overlooked in their national policies. And they say, if you're invisible in everyday life, your needs will not be thought of, let alone addressed in a crisis situation. So if we do not recognize that there are other genders, that there is gender non-conforming people, there are trans people, and if we do not ensure that these people have the documentation, for example, the documentation they need, they may not be able to avail the schemes, right? I will pause here and open space for any questions that anyone might have at this point or any thoughts to share. You can please feel free to put them on chat. Any questions so far? Or any thoughts on what we have talked about? Can you think of an example where we might have addressed or where our policy might have been approached from a feminist lens? Okay, then we will move ahead. But if at any point you have any questions or any thoughts, please feel free to put them on chat. Now we look at how can we actually bring the while preparing the climate change policies itself, we should include a feminist in the team. Yes, absolutely. Which is why when we think of drafting policies, or when we even think of drafting any sort of schemes, we do encourage participation of women. We do encourage capacity building of women, and not just women, but also other people, right? People from other genders. Because if we are not making space for them to come in and speak about their needs, then how do we know how what the needs are on the ground? If I am not bringing in, let's say, a representative, even let's start from a very micro level. If we speak, let's say it's a family, right? A family of 6 people, um, parents, children, grandparents. If we do not talk about, or if we do not check about children's needs, how will we address them? If we do not make space for them to come forward and express their needs or express any concerns, then how are we going to address them? Which is why when we speak about climate change policies, or when we speak of bringing in a gender lens to climate change policies, we also speak of making space for participation of women and people from other genders, so that they can take active role in making these policies and address, so in a way that can actually address the needs on the ground. So here we have a recognition and policy approach. This Here you'll see something. If a policy does not take into account gendered vulnerability at all, it's we would consider it as gender blind and gender neutral. So gender blind would simply imply that it's implicitly male biased and excludes women. If it's gender neutral, then we are using a one fits all approach, which, you know, how when we go for shopping and we have these sections, men and women, if we were to have gender neutral stores, then there would be no sections, and we would just assume that people of all genders, or people of these two genders in this case, have the similar body type, so they do not need different kind of clothes, and we can just make similar kind of clothes for both these groups, and that would be okay. But that's not the case, right? We do have these sections for a reason, because men and women tend to have differential body types. Then we have gender specific, which identifies women as vulnerable victims of climate change. So here, women are just being identified as a group who is affected by it, which then translates to interventions targeted at addressing their needs, but within existing distribution of resources and responsibilities. So again, bringing in the COVID-19 example, we also saw, this was, I think, immediately after the first, or even during the first phase of lockdown, we also saw a marked increase in domestic violence cases. What that meant was, because the lockdown had been announced on such a short notice, there was not enough consideration taken into place that some women may have been forced to be, or to stay in proximity to their abuser, which led to an increase in domestic violence. Or we did not anticipate, or the authorities did not anticipate that domestic violence or violence against women will actually go up during the lockdown periods, and that will need targeted intervention. I remember engaging in a research which required me to talk to community based organizations in different parts of the country, and they were also sharing their experiences, how difficult it was even for them to be able to support the survivors or support anyone who was stuck in that position, because there was a lockdown, there was no public transport available. So even if somebody wanted to leave their house, they could not have done that until and unless they had access to their private vehicles. Even that would have been very difficult. So this shows that that was more of a specific response which did not take into account that women may not have access to their private transport, and they tend to rely more on public transport. Then we move from gender specific to gender sensitive. This is about looking at women as amenable to adapting, which means you'll see a lot of times when we speak of climate change or any literature on climate change, what happens is they tend to report that women are more, uh, women tend to adapt quickly to the environment, and they are more concerned about the environment in general, and that's again tying back to their increased dependence on natural resources or increased interaction with the physical environment around them. So how then this translates to policy approaches? It identifies factors and processes which shape gender relations and how these might be refigured. From gender sensitive, we aim to move to gender redistributive or gender transformative, which will look at which recognizes women as active agents of change with key capacities to contribute. And policy wise, it will mean that there will be interventions that intend to transform existing distribution of resources and responsibilities with a view of creating a more equitable society which is reflected in equitable gender relationships that focuses on strategic interest. So anything that is intending to be gender redistributive or gender transformative will be strategic in nature, and it will do more than just addressing people's immediate needs. So when we speak of addressing needs, there is also the element of addressing or being able to address immediate needs and more long-term needs. So, for example, again, one of the schemes that we have seen, even in case of, I would say, natural disasters, what happens is the immediate response of authorities or stakeholders is to provide relief efforts, right? Because people need basic needs fulfilled, like food, shelter, water, and things like that. So those are very short term needs. But think about people or think about displacement. Their long term needs could mean long access to affordable housing or access to livelihood options, right? Because displacement also means that you may have lost your source of income. So then, how do we address that? That gets covered when we look at addressing, or then when we look at forming policies from a redistributive or transformative, gender redistributive or transformative approach. Any questions on this or any thoughts? Anything that you would like me to go over again? I'll wait a couple of minutes on this slide. Let me know if there are any thoughts or any questions on this. Okay. Taking a question from chat, can you let us know these things can be inculcated during the school level itself? That's an interesting question. When we look at climate change, there is very basic level of information that is given at the school level, right? We are taught about how we're taught about climate change, that okay, this is happening and this is a problem, but we are very it doesn't move beyond that. So at school level, I would say, I think there we can advocate for certain changes, or you know how in schools we also have extracurricular activities. So maybe organizing events that specifically focus on climate change, and doing this every year, not just as a one-off event, but also having a full week on climate change awareness. I know some schools. So I am based out of Delhi, and I know some schools here in Delhi have a very strong focus on climate change. They have some specific societies, specific groups that students can join in, where they also conduct cleanliness drives, and this is also true for I think also college level students. So they conduct cleanliness drives, they conduct recycling drives, and little things like this. I think this can also have an impact on how aware students, or how aware we can become at that level. And beyond that, if we look at bringing in a gendered lens, or if we're bringing in a feminist lens to climate change at the school level, then we also have to look at revising our curriculum. Um, Revising our curriculum from the point of view of acknowledging that there is more to gender than just the gender binary, and then looking at the differential impact of what climate change or climate crisis can have on different groups. Also, reading other points, there is a strong gender bias. Women will have more stake in understanding. Yes, women might have a more stake in understanding, but also think about it. When we say women, who are we thinking? Or who is coming to our mind? What are the other identities does this women or does women as a group have? When we think of women in decision making process, who is the one who is getting access, or has the resources to be participating in decision making process? Feminist research provides complementary analytical tools for conceptualizing the full extent of climate crisis. Agreed. Yes. Which is why we will focus on feminist research tools. For now, we'll cover the gender action plan that has been recommended by UNFCCC. That has been recommended for all countries to adopt as part of their climate change policy, which addresses gender and beyond moves beyond seeing women as a homogeneous group. Any other? Okay, I'm just gonna move here. So we have spoken about what is the need for gender responsive policies and gender responsive actions, but there are also certain barriers that need to be addressed as we think of, or as we reimagine policies from a gendered lens. When it comes to barriers, we need to look at the structural barriers that may prevent women's active participation in the decision making process, or the barriers that prevent their access to resources and information. So, structural barriers can refer to unequal distribution of wealth and opportunities, which means the opportunities in terms of, let's say, employment opportunities that are available to men and any to a group of cishet men versus any other group looks different, right? Now, if we were to add other layers of identity, employment opportunities that are available to a man who is English speaking as versus someone who does not know how to speak or how to converse in English would look different. That this employment opportunity will also determine how much will also have an impact on on their levels of income. This is what we speak of when we think of structural barriers. Think about women's ownership of land, right? When agriculture is one of the major source of income for women, but when we look at ownership of land, then women actually tend to own less. The ownership of land, the rate of ownership is less for women as compared to men. The other kind of barriers are normative. I mentioned an example from Bangladesh. So those norms, those sociocultural gender norms also shape how we interact with the society, how we interact with our environment. If there is a societal norm or societal expectation that I am not supposed to step outside of my house without a male relative being present, which is true for a lot of countries, then I will have restricted access to a lot of places. I may not be accessing public spaces. I may not be able to access banks. I may not be able to even access, let's say, other authorities, right? Where I might be able to get some information. So, what happens when the government wants to disseminate information on any climate change related event, right? If you are sending WhatsApp messages, then are we looking at if women have access to phones, if women have access to internet? Normative barriers also refers to gender norms and perceptions and the attitudes that feed the frame within the context, and that can contribute to livelihood related activities. So on one hand, I'm saying women are responsible for securing water and fuel, which means they often have to walk long distances to secure water, right? But on the other hand, we also know that women may not be able to access public spaces without a male relative. Then we look at capacity barriers, which refers to women's access to knowledge and information, training, innovation, and technology. So even going back to my employment opportunities example, maybe the kind of employment opportunities that are present or that are available for men and women are similar. But if women do not have the capacity to take up those jobs, then it's not going to work out. So, you know how girls are discouraged from taking up science subjects or they're discouraged from taking up STEM subjects. Why? Because there is this um, stereotype or a perception that girls are more suited for softer sciences or for humanities stream as opposed to, let's say, business stream or science stream. Then moving ahead, they will not be able to avail of opportunities in the field of STEM related subjects, right? Which then significantly determines their level of income. Then we look at decision making barriers, which highlights the gap that exists in terms of women's representation. So, as Dipali has mentioned on chat, women will have more stake in understanding. That will only happen if we work also on the decision making barriers. Again, going back to micro levels, right? In a family, in a patriarchal family where you have the man as the sole earner, who is taking the financial decisions or who has the agency to make major decisions for the family. Or think about an RWA, a residents welfare association. Do you see representation of both men and women from different households, or do you just see men coming together to make decisions for RWA? An example of these barriers, or an example that can actually highlight these barriers would be, um, okay, so think about um, a residential area, very a small area that has about 15 to 20 houses, 15 to 20 families living there, and they have realized that the street light has stopped working in their area. Now, if the RWA has solely men representing the households, it is possible that the value or the importance of streetlight might be a little less. But when we think of women participating in that decision making process, that okay, we need to raise this concern to authorities so that we can get the street light fixed, then there are other needs that will get highlighted, right? So for example, they'll be having a street light on the street for in their area also might make them feel safe when they step out. There may be households who may actively prevent girls and women from stepping out after dark because the street light is not working. So, if women are not being represented in the decision making process, or if they're not being consulted in the decision making process, then their needs might get overlooked. Any thoughts on this before we move on to what the framework for including gender in climate change policies looks like? Okay, we will move ahead. We will look at the policy frameworks that have taken into consideration gender and that have aimed to mainstream gender in climate change policies. These are international frameworks. Then we will also look at what national level policies look like. I would encourage you all to engage with the content on chat. Feel free to add your thoughts, what you think about policies, or what you think can be done differently. Or if you have any questions that you would like me to address during the course of this workshop, please feel free to put them on chat as well. Okay, so this is a timeline of how the gender has actually come into notice when it comes to climate action policies. COP20, that was the 20th conference of the parties, held in 2014, established the Lima Work Program on Gender. It was a policy initiative that aimed to advocate for gender mainstreaming in climate change policies. Then in 2016, there was a 3-year extension granted to this initiative, to this policy that looked at mainstreaming gender. And in 2017, first gender action plan was adopted with 5 priority areas. This is what a gender action plan looks like. We look at each of these priority areas, and I would encourage you all to think about how we can engage within each of these priority areas at our own levels or through our own work. So, first, priority area A is about capacity building, knowledge management, and communication. The objective here was to systematically integrate gender considerations into climate change or climate action policies, and the idea to facilitate outreach and knowledge sharing and knowledge exchange between countries for for enhancing climate change or for climate change policies or gender responsive climate action policies. Any thoughts on how we can do this through our own work, or what does working within this priority area will look like? What kind of activities can we think of when we think of building capacity, knowledge management, and communication? Any thoughts on that? So we could actively work on building capacity in within, let's say, within our own organization. This could look like having sessions that actively speak about climate change, that actively focus on the current literature on climate justice and how we can approach it, or how we can contribute towards it. In fact, this can also include like capacity building on how we can mainstream gender in the policies, or just research. Yes, awareness can be the first one. Exactly. So this is the first priority area, is focusing a lot more on awareness. It is looking at research and understanding the differential impact. So before we jump into creating a gender responsive policy, it's important for us to actually understand the differential impacts across both, right? Which means doing extensive research and looking at women as, or recognizing women as agents of change making and not just as people who are affected by it. And again, the reason why I keep going back to the women example is because these frameworks see gender or speak of gender in binaries. This is called a gender action plan, which puts focus or puts heavy focus on women and not on and does not recognize that women are not a homogeneous group, or does not recognize people of other genders or gender non-conforming people. The second priority area is about gender balance, participation, and women's leadership. The focus here was to achieve and sustain equal and meaningful participation of women in policy making process. So we have spoken a lot about how decision making process also needs to include women, or also needs representation not just from women but also from other groups whose needs we are aiming to address. So if I am working to develop a policy, or even again bringing it down to a very small scale, I would say organizationally, if the leadership team is bringing in some changes within their policy, maybe they are looking to change their work hours. Maybe they want to give they are trying to decide if they want to offer flexible work timings. What is the best way to do that? The best way would be to consult the team within the organization and see if there is a need for flexible work timings, or if there is a need for flexible work hours. At corporate level, uh, sometimes we see that companies only offer maternity leave for a set period of time, and that is all. But what about when the women, or when those women who took maternity leave come back to the work? What about their needs then? And how can the companies address this? By actually talking to them. by ensuring that they also get a say in the decisions or in the policy making within the organization. So, creating a platform where we can invite people from groups, where we bring together people or representatives of different communities to consult and to ensure that their voices are heard in the decision making process. The other part of this priority area promotes initiatives for building capacity in terms of leadership, and also even as simple as mobilizing funds for women to be able to attend these events, right? To be able to access these platforms. What if I want to reach women from the tribal groups? And they may not have access to info, and then it's on us as someone who may be organizing this platform. It is on us on ensuring how can I best make this information reachable for them. How can I best communicate with them? How can I then ensure that they have so if I'm doing this if I'm doing an event virtually, then it then how can I ensure that they also have access to the internet on that day so that they can be present. Also, looking at chat, gender responsive climate change strategies can focus on creating economic opportunities for both men and women, actually inclusive of all. Yes, which is where the transformative approach comes in, right? That tackling the core issues, tackling the root causes of or root causes that actually contribute to the people, to the communities experiencing the impact of climate change differently. Priority area C talks about coherence. So it's not just one. So you know, a good example of this priority area would be just ensuring that all your streams of work are actually in sync with each other. So, so at OFC, climate change is a lens that we take across board. Climate change is a lens that we take in all our programs, in all our courses. It is not just, it's not going to be this one-off workshop that we are doing, let's say climate change from a feminist lens, and then we go back to our work and we never speak of it. No. Um, we take this lens across our work. It's important that there is a coherence between stakeholders, ensuring that all stakeholders are working in sync with each other, ensuring that they are coordinated within their efforts to mainstream gender in their policies. Then we have priority area D, which talks about gender responsive implementation and means of implementation. So far, we have spoken about building capacity, that's at an awareness level. Then we have spoken about investing in women's leadership. And then we have spoken about coherence, which is ensuring or strengthening collaborative and coherent efforts to employ a gender lens. Then we have gender responsive implementation and means of implementation, which is priority area D. This means keeping gender at the center while implementing policies. So it's not just enough to ensure representation or to invest in their leadership. When it comes to implementation, again, gendered lens has to be adopted. An example of here, an example of an activity under this priority area could look like uh, engaging women in implementing those policies. So if I think of running an awareness campaign or running an awareness drive within a local community, and my target group is women, and the focus of awareness campaign could be anything, right? It could be information on SRHR, or it could be information on climate change, let's say. So then how do I ensure that women are also involved in the implementation part of it? How do I see women not as just beneficiaries, but also as stakeholders, as active stakeholders who can contribute to implementation as well? Because when we do that, then it is only through them I will be able to understand that, okay, what is the best time to run this session within that community? Maybe maybe within that community there would be a common time in the afternoon where women meet in a public space, or maybe they meet in the morning. So these things like this, it can only, this sort of insight can only come from when come it can only come when we actually work with women to implement these programs. This priority area also focuses on enhancing the availability of sex disaggregated data for gender analysis. So we have spoken about how important it is to include gender in policy making or in any sort of action plan or a response plan, right? But what that the way we record data or the way we record needs also make a lot of difference. So sex disaggregate data is an important element that helps to conduct a gender analysis and can better inform gender responsive climate policies, plans, strategies, and actions. Then we speak of monitoring and reporting. That is the last priority area. This the objective here is to improve um, the data collection element and improve implementation and reporting of gender related programs or gender related mandates as per the gender action plan. Any questions on this? Any questions or any thoughts as to how we can engage within these priority areas even at our own levels? That could be at individual or that could be at community, organizational, work, not work. How can we do this? Or think of strategies or think of ways that you can use these priority areas across board. So this is not just for, so for example, when we say the importance of sex disaggregated data, it's not only for relevant for climate change policies, right? It is relevant for any sort of response plan or any sort of policies that we might want to bring in. If we were to develop a gender plan right now under this framework, keeping these priority areas in mind, how would we engage under each of these priority areas? Any thoughts on that? I will also put this question on chat. If we were to develop a gender plan right now under this framework, which is the Gender Action Plan by UNFCC, how would we engage with each of these priority areas? Or if you can all reflect on your organization's work, if you are here from an organization or any workplace, do you think any of these priority areas you already engage with? What are the ways that you already do, or how are you already doing that? I'll take the school question as a guiding point here. If how can we engage at school level with these priority areas? Any thoughts on that? Right. So first of all, we would need a team, right? What would that team look like, or who would do you think should be a part of that team if we are doing this at the school level? The higher management to take decisions, okay, along with teachers and student reps, right? So when we think of student representatives, can we be more concrete with our example? Parent association representatives, yes. With respect to students, who do you think, like which class would you approach, or what age group or what grade would you want to be represented in the team? Okay, fit with the current generation. Sure. So, like how we are also taking into account that there might be a generation gap, and students, right? Students would be might be more aware nowadays, right? Because we have relatively easier access to information, relatively easier access to resources that where we can look up information. Agreed. What would the next step be? So now we have a team. We have the higher management representative from a higher management who can actually help with taking some major decision making. Then we have teacher representatives, we have students, and we have representatives from parents association. What would the next step be? Addressing the issues, right? So think about these priority areas, right? How, right, collating them. How can we go about addressing the issues? Or what is, think programmatically, let's say if we are to organize a cleanliness drive in the school, within the school premises. So what is the, or what would be the relevant priority area here? Also keeping in mind that any program or any sort of policy may not be able to address all of the priority areas at once. B and D, right? So it's about gender balance, participation and leadership, and then gender responsive implementation and means of implementation. Right. We also have Aparna saying setting up a curriculum, practical and application based, yes, which will come under our priority area A, which is about capacity building, knowledge management. Do you think bringing in representatives from different groups like the higher management, parents association, students, and teachers, we are already trying to establish some sort of coherence? That's our priority area C. We're already trying to bring in or focus on collaborative efforts, right? We are not saying that the team would just be one particular group. So we are trying to establish coherence within the team itself. If we are to move away from the school example and let's say we want to focus on, let's take the example of an RWA that is deciding whether they want to invest or they want to pool in money to uh, to sort of restructure their public park. Of course, that's not something that they can do entirely by themselves. How can they go about that then? Trying to decide if this is something that they want to do. Weighing in the pros and cons, right? Weighing in the pros and cons, and of course, something that they can't do by themselves, which means that they'll have to consult everybody involved or consult people who usually access those spaces, right? Um, yes. So when we think of it at a national level, the example that's coming to my mind right now is the Trans Rights Act, and how before the bill was passed, government called for um, called for inputs from groups or from stakeholders within the communities. So that was a way for the government to ensure that the insight from the communities, to ensure that representation from the community is also implemented in the decision making process. Or the recent another example that's coming to my mind is the G20 meet, right? There was a call from the government um, asking people Um, think it was focusing on different elements, different thematic areas, and what should be the focus for India, and just asking for suggestions, right? So open calls like this ensure that the insights from within the community or from the ground level can be captured, but then it becomes their responsibility to ensure that that is reflected in the final output of this process. Okay. Now we will look at what India's climate change policy and what India's efforts look like. So in 2009, India adopted the National Action Plan on Climate Change and asked the central government or the center asked the states to prepare their own plans. Do you think that's relevant, or do you think that's a useful way to go about this, asking states to prepare their own action plan for climate change? Or do you think that the center should have just made one plan that should have been implemented across all states? Okay, yes. Would you like to elaborate, Aparna? Um, why do we think that plan as per states is the right approach? Any other thoughts on that? Why do we think that's the right way to do or right way to approach this? Each state, right. Thank you, Lekha. Each state has its own set of vulnerabilities as per the geography and other factors, right? Exactly. So if you if you try and visualize the geographical map or geographical terrain of India, we'll see that it varies region to region, right? Um, and depending on that, people's vulnerability also varies. People's identity also varies. Their source of livelihood varies. So all of these factors can be accounted for when we think of or when we look at um, yeah, because thank you, Aparna. Because every state has its own climate-related pros and cons. If they are involved in making plans, would work better. Exactly. So this also gives some autonomy to the states in terms of how they can, each of them can make a plan for themselves, how they want to implement it, and how they can also do stakeholder consultations. Bec- Um, so this is why the idea was that state will prepare their own climate action plans and then also be responsible for implementing and monitoring it. In 2018, so remember the going back to this slide, the gender action plan with five priority areas, first gender action plan with five priority areas was launched in 2017. And in 2018, India welcomed the adoption of this gender action plan and acknowledges the key priority areas. India also recognized the differential impact of climate change on women. And in their response to this gender action plan, um, India also highlighted some gender sensitive programs that we already have in motion. So there, one of them is Pradhan Mantri Ujjwal Yojana that aims to provide LPG um, to households. This is a move to safeguard the health of women and children so that their health is not compromised due to burning and collection of firewood. Then there is this other program called Support to Training and Employment Program for Women, STEP for brief. This program aims to provide skills that give employability to women and provide competencies that enable them to become either self employed or entrepreneurs in different sectors like agriculture, handlooms, stitching, handicrafts, embroidery. Can you think of any other programs, any other gender sensitive programs that are currently active at the national level? There has been a strong focus on maternal health. That's another example of gender sensitive plan. Now we'll briefly look at some of the states that include gender in their state action plan for climate change. And if they do include gender, how do they recognize women? So here, as you can see in this table, um, states like Andhra Pradesh, Arunachal Pradesh, Haryana, Madhya Pradesh, these states do not, in their state action plan, there is no mention of gendered vulnerability. And if I go back to this slide, if there is no recognition of gendered vulnerability, we are saying the state action plan is either gender blind or it's gender neutral. Then we have states like Bihar, Bihar, Chhattisgarh, Himachal Pradesh, Nagaland, Punjab, Tamil Nadu, Rajasthan. These states identify women or recognize women as victims of climate change. So when they are looking at women, they are only looking in terms of the differential impact of climate change that women tend to experience. And going back to this slide, this means this means we have moved from gender blind and gender neutral to being gender specific. Then three states that include Kerala, Tripura, Uttarakhand look at women capable of adapting and more amenable to behavioral change. So, because there is an increased dependence on natural resources, because there is uh, more interaction with their environment, there is more capacity and more capability for adaptation, and they are more open to behavioral change. Going back to this slide, it means we have moved from gender specific to gender sensitive. and we look at the last row, so we have states Bihar, Chhattisgarh, Gujarat, Uttarakhand. So you will see Bihar, Chhattisgarh, Gujarat coming in both in the second row and the last row. So they identify or they recognize women as victims of climate change, but they also recognize women as change makers and their capacity to contribute, which then informs their policies. So maybe there is a heavy focus on capacity building and investing in women's leadership. This is an example of gender transformative or gender redistributive framework because it's identifying women as active agents of change with key capacities to contribute. And then the way it informs the policy is that there will be interventions that are intended to transform existing inequalities, to bring in more equitable gender relationship, and there will be a heavy focus on strategic interest rather than just addressing some short-term needs of people. I'm happy to share all of these resources. I will put my email ID on chat once I'm done. And if any of you would like to take this conversation forward, or if any of you would like to access these resources, the research that I've used in this presentation, please feel free to reach out. This is also to note that so far we do not have a concrete gender action plan in place. So in 2017, when the first gender action plan was launched, and India did recognize the efforts and all of that, and then highlighted. Um, India recognized the importance of creating a gender action plan in response to climate change and highlighted the gender sensitive programs that already exist. But there is a need for states to incorporate gender for at state level in within their action plans. Looking at Kiran's question, what will be the indicators for women entrepreneurship in climate change? Okay, so this reminds me of this program. There is, I will just type it here in chat. What program by Arrow and EFPA? Um, this program that's called Women and Earth Initiative. It looked at how we can look at women as how we can look at women and their sources of livelihood or women entrepreneurship in the context of climate change. Some indicators it can include, so think about it. How many women in different parts of the country are actually dependent or are actually interacting with the environment for their livelihood, or they're dependent for it, they're dependent on it for their livelihoods. Um, what if their major source of income is agriculture, or what if I am an entrepreneur who who sells flowers in the flower market, right? And how does climate change then come into play? Or what if my awareness campaign that is led by women, we are unable to do our campaigns, we are unable to do our sessions because of heavy rains within that area? And in a corresponding intervention for that could be providing loans at the subsidized rates to women entrepreneurs whose livelihoods may have been affected because of climate change? Do you think that is something that could work? Research also shows that women-led or women entrepreneurs are eh, if we look at their risk-taking behavior, it's conservative as compared to men entrepreneurs, which means they are less likely to take risks. They are less likely to go. They are less likely to um adopt innovative methods, right? But how does or what can policy level change? What can be certain policy level changes that can enable them to take on more risk or to take on, or that can create space for innovation in their business? Any thoughts? Government could also provide, or other funders could also provide small seed funding to women from displaced uh, communities or from migrant communities who may be looking to start their own small businesses. Do you think that's something that could work? Right. Thank you, Lekha. Yes, that will work. I think there are multiple such programs where small women entrepreneurs are guided and trained. Yes, exactly. So it's moving beyond the funding element. We could actually have capacity building trainings that could focus on skill building elements. We could have even capacity building in terms of financial investments. Yes, that can be one parameter. Yes. Now we now I would like to shift the conversation a bit. We have looked at different factors. We have talked about women and employment, women and entrepreneurship, women and their dependence on natural resources and their interaction with the environment. But now I would like to shift the conversation to sexual and gender based violence in the context of climate change. Do you think these two are linked? Okay, I've just created a poll. Do you think SGBV and climate change are linked, are interlinked? If you click on polls, you might be able to see and vote for your answer. Just waiting a couple of minutes for folks to answer and then we can discuss. So far, I'm seeing all yes as responses on the poll. Would anyone like to bring in some points or share your thoughts on how do you think SGBV and climate change are interlinked? Please feel free to use the chat very openly. I my facilitation style is more interactive, and I thoroughly enjoy interacting with the participants. I believe that we come together in this space, and this also makes provides an opportunity to learn from each other. Climate change involves the effect of other SDG. Do you want to elaborate a bit on that, Kiran? Or even anyone else, if you want to share any thoughts on how do you think SGBV and climate change are interlinked, please feel free to put them down on chat. Yes, sexual and gender-based violence. Thank you for defining that, Lekha. So I'll be honest, when I was starting to learn about climate crisis and climate change in detail, I was actually surprised to see that climate change is interlinked with gender-based violence. It's not something like, when we were talking about schools and when we look at the curriculum, it's not something that we are taught in formal educational systems. and it's not something that even comes to your mind. Like, how does SGBV linked or can be related with climate change? And when I read more and more literature to it on it, that is when I realized there's a lot, of course, to be understood about differential impacts of climate change. And when we look at interlinkages of SGBV and climate change, it is not just um, it's bringing in a feminist approach to it, right? It's talking about climate justice, because it's talking about how changes in the climate or how these disasters actually exacerbate the inequalities, or um, the, exacerbates the existing inequalities that then leads to SGBV. Um, so one of the examples that's coming to my mind right now is about sanitation facilities, right? If we think, if we look at how women, and you may have come across cases like this in the news. There's sometimes you might hear about how a woman. Sorry, before I go ahead, I would like to give a trigger warning here that we will be discussing issues of violence, and there will be some mentions of sexual assault and rape. And if you would like to step away from the workshop, please feel free to do that. I will wait for 30 seconds before I continue, and also putting trigger warning in chat. Okay, reading Lekha's message, women are affected more significantly than men by disasters, right? This is due to gender inequalities and power imbalances in access to resources and information. Yes. So when you think of situations that might require communities to leave behind their houses and physically move to a different area, right? Something that's happening actually in a region in Uttarakhand right now, where people are being suggested to leave behind their houses and their because there is a risk of landslides and flooding in that area. There's an active risk. This also exposes them or makes them more vulnerable to gender-based violence, or other forms of sexual violence. Um, when they sorry, when we look at interlinkages of SGBV and climate change, we see a bunch of factors come into play. So I was going to give the example of sanitation. If there is no sanitation facility within the house, then the women may have to go to a faraway field to relieve themselves. And that can be um, a space for violence. These, you may have come across some cases in the news sometimes, that a woman who went to relieve herself was harassed or was assaulted. And accessing sanitation facilities is a right. um, this is something that it's a need for everyone, right? But because there is no sanitation facility available within the house, the women has to go outside, and then there they get harassed or they get assaulted. Looking at chat, higher people are displaced during and after disasters, right? Displacement can lead to an increase in violence and due to overcrowded and unsafe living conditions in temporary shelters. Yes, the shelters become a space for violence. And don't think of violence just as something that's very explicit, something that's explicitly physical or sexual, but also think of emotional abuse that comes into play, or think of malnutrition, right? When we speak of women and when we speak of their care work, malnutrition amongst women and girls is a major problem, and this is something that just boils down to something as simple as women eating last in the household, right? Which means, and you, this is something that you might have even seen in your own house, your mother or any women in the house saying that, I'll eat at the end, it's okay, or I'll eat whatever is left, that's fine. And this is very common amongst women who are primary caregivers in a lot of houses, right? Malnutrition in this way also becomes a form of violence. So when we speak of uh, violence, I would encourage you all to broaden your understanding and not look at it in terms of harassment or sexual or physical, but there are other forms of violence that are very subtle, that may go unnoticed, to the point that they may not even get addressed at policy level. But bringing back the conversation to SGBV, that's specifically focusing on sexual and gender-based violence. Reading message: women staying in shelters are exposed to rape, harassment, and violence, and also have limited access to reproductive health services. Exactly. So, restricting someone's access to health services, would you think of that as a form of violence? Or how does that then translate, or how does that make them more vulnerable to violence? We speak about India's population, and the common thought process then becomes that the country is overcrowded. There are a lot of people. There's the problem of overpopulation, and we do not have enough resources. Um, but when we actually try and break that down, it is possible that it's not because people are not aware of this, but it's because the access to services is restricted. So, what if women staying in shelters, like Lekha has mentioned, women staying in shelters are exposed to rape? Or what if a woman is raped in a shelter that they're staying in after being displaced from their own community, from their homeland, and they do not have and they are pregnant and they do not have access to reproductive health services? It is likely, if they would like to get an abortion, it is likely that they may not be able to access that service. This is where our gender transformative or gender responsive policies come in, right? If I think of providing relief efforts or relief measures for people who have been affected by a disaster, who have been forced to move because of climate change related events, or even because of other incidents like war areas, right? Due to violence in other forms, due to riots, how do I then ensure that whatever relief plans that I'm making also addresses that women or mensurators, as we say? I will also type this word in chat. We use this word to highlight that it is not just women who menstruate, right? Menstruators, they may need access to menstrual hygiene products. They may need access to reproductive health services. How do I then, in my relief efforts or in my relief plans, ensure that these are all things that are being considered? This can only happen when I bring in a feminist lens or when I bring in a gender lens to it. If I look at creating a plan or creating any sort of scheme from a very gender neutral lens, then these needs might get overlooked, which we have seen time and time again. Um, why women in what areas or in countries that are severely affected by wars more vulnerable to gender based violence? If I take an example uh, of a metro city like Delhi, right? Something as simple as wanting to take up a job that requires me to travel significant distance. Let's say that requires me to travel 15 kilometers. And this may not seem like a climate change relevant example, but think about it. Um, my choice to take up a job that requires me to travel 15 kilometers also takes into account the risk that I will be taking every day during that journey. I will have to look the mode of transportation that's available. I may not have access to my own private transportation. I may not have enough financial resources to be able to afford a cab every day, which means that I will be taking public transportation every day. So even something as basic as a choice to take up a job is governed by my gender identity, is governed by gender or by power relations within the society. Any other examples that you can think of when we speak of gender based violence and climate change? So, take an example of child marriages. Right, there is research that shows farmer with Shashikala has mentioned farmer widows, land, and domestic violence. Yes, that's a very good example. If um, if I speak of a family that's whose major source of income is livelihood, and maybe the man was a farmer and was responsible for agricultural based activities for livelihood, and due to untimely or unfortunate death, now the woman has to take up that activity. So now the women will be the negotiator, and maybe they don't own that land. Maybe there is someone else who owns that land. Maybe somebody who belongs to an upper caste who owns that land. That then puts that women at risk of violence. I was going to give an example of child marriages and how that also research has shown that how rates of child marriages also increases in context of climate change in the light of events in during events like drought and flooding. Especially suicide caused due to death with herba reason. Yes, and suicide caused due to death. I would again encourage you all to think about. Would I know farmer suicide is a key issue in the country? Would you say that is a form of gender-based violence? And again, this also broadens our understanding of violence, right? Suicide due to death, uh, which means that you are being driven to a point where you think that the only way out is suicide. And that's taking away your fundamental right to life. Anything that infringes on your fundamental rights, would you consider that as violence? Yes, thank you for bringing that in, Shashikala. So, if we only see, because stereotypically we assume that farmers are men, and when we speak of farmer suicide, we may just be thinking of men, then it would not be considered a gender issue. But when we also take into account women farmers, or when we are specifically talking about women farmers, then we also have to take account their gender identity and how the challenges for women farmers might actually look very different than what it looks for men farmers. Thank you for bringing that in. Also, going back to yes, Lekha's point on women staying in shelters are exposed to rape, harassment, and violence. It's that also exposes them to intimate partner violence, right? That also exposes them to domestic violence, marital rape. And of course, the problem with marital rape is that it's not even recognized by under law. And something that is, or a form of violence that is not even recognized um, under law, then how do you ensure that is addressed? Or how do you then ensure the needs of those women are addressed? Which is where our coherence parts come in, right? When we speak of climate justice, when we bring in a feminist lens to climate justice, we say that we want to transform the gender relations, or we want to transform the unequal power relations that are existing within the society. And that means taking active efforts in other streams of work as well, or in other thematic areas as well, that might be contributing to these unequal power relations. So this was the last segment of the workshop. I am here for another 10 minutes if you all have any questions, or if there is anything specific that you would like to discuss. But that was all from me. I hope this workshop has been insightful, and I hope when you leave this space, there will be some reflections with respect to what we have discussed with those work in this time. Thank you so much for being here today. Here we have our contact details.